Hi, and welcome to Essence of Wonder. Sometimes with Gadi Evron. Gadi's not with us today, but my name is Karen, and happy to talk with our guests today about Chinese science fiction and the many different dimensions of it. So I'd like to introduce Regina Kanyu Yang. Regina, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, nice to meet you, everyone.
Very nice to meet you. Regina, you've worked through our first of our two panels, and I'd also like to bring one other guest, Yen Wei, who is also with us today. Hi, Yen. How are you doing today?
Hi, everyone. I'm really well. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much for being with us. And can you tell us about just a little bit about our first panel today, Regina?
Yes, of course. So in our first panel, we have three panelists who are now living in Asia. So basically, it's now midnight for them. So we have pre-recorded the panel, and our panelists are Feng Zhang, Chen Qiufan, and Emily Jin. So they are all very experienced Chinese science fiction fans, researchers, and writers, and also entrepreneurs. And they have shared with us multidimensionally about their experience and knowledge about Chinese science fiction.
Amazing. And I realize, Regina, I didn't talk very much about what you do, but I should pick up a bit of your background also. So you're a PhD fellow at the Co-Futures Project at the University of Oslo, as well as a writer in both science fiction and nonfiction. And as I understand it, your research interest is specifically within Chinese science fiction from the gender and environmental perspectives, fiction and nonfiction. And, amazing. Well, without much further ado, then I would love to take us into this recorded panel. I'm very excited for it. Are we ready to go?
Yeah, excited to see it.
All right, we'll talk to you again right after.
Thank you so much, Gadi, and a great many thanks for Essence of Wonder for holding us. First, let's introduce ourselves, I guess. I'm Regina Kanyu, and I will be the moderator of today. I am currently a PhD fellow at the Co-Futures Project at the University of Oslo. And my research object is contemporary Chinese science fiction from the gender and environmental perspective. I'm also a science fiction writer and have been working for Storycon for many years as the overseas market director. And my main ability is to promote Chinese science fiction abroad, which means I do a lot of things like this. And all of our panelists do similar things like that. So let's get to know them. Maybe Emily first.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a translator of science fiction and fantasy. I currently am a PhD student at Yale University, Department of East Asian Languages and Literature. And my research focus is on cognitive science and literature, the intersection.
Hi. My name is Feng. My nickname is Sam Feng. I'm based in Shenzhen right now. I'm a science fiction researcher and a critic. I'm teaching at the Southern University for Science and Technology. I'm working with Professor Wu in his Center for Science and Human Imagination. My research interests include science fiction and industry, science fiction and innovation, and science fiction and cities.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chen Qiufan. I'm right now in Beijing, but I usually based in Shanghai. So I'm a speculative author. I'm the author of Waste Tide and the forthcoming AI 2041, co-authoring with Dr. Kai-Fu Li, supposed to be published on September the 14th by Penguin Random House. So looking forward to talking to you.
As we just hear, our panelists actually have been coming from different areas. but they are all working on science fiction. And the reason why we are gathering them here is partly because we had just published this special issue of Vector, the critical journal of British Science Fiction Association. And all of panelists have contributed to this special issue. And they have been written on different topics and things. So I myself, for example, have contributed a piece about the history of Chinese science fiction, in which I try to trace back to late Qing dynasty, from late Qing dynasty to contemporary, about how female characters and the female writers existed in the entire history of Chinese science fiction. And also I have invited different industry practitioners in Chinese science fiction, like all those different organizations and the companies, to have them make an introduction of themselves and tell us about like how what role they are playing in the entire Chinese science fiction industry. So it's really a large work. And I will also like next move to let our panelists to talk a little about like what kind of contribution they have made to this issue. And we will then start the discussion based on their contribution to the issue and also like their knowledge of the Chinese science fiction multidimensionally. Okay, maybe we can start with Stan first this time.
Thanks, Regina, and also Yan in this panel. So you organized such a wonderful special issue of Vector. So there's a conversation, me and Miss Maggie Shen King. She's American Asia. So she's also a speculative author with her debut novel, Excel Man. So we have a very in-depth conversation moderated by Yan. So we discuss the process of how we countering the idea of our book, like Which Tide and Excel Man. So, and also the cultural metaphor behind the story and how we think about using the format of speculative fiction to express some further issues of in the society of Asian society, especially. So including gender issue and also ecology issues and also class issue, etc., etc. So it really brought me a lot of new ideas of how we can escalate science fiction or speculative fiction as a tool to deliver more important message to the broader audience. So I'll say right now is the best time for science fiction, especially Chinese science fiction or Asian science fiction, because we can see worldwide and there's an uprising voice out from the Asian community. So I think now is the time like we need to stay together and explore different ways of using this kind of narrative to explore our identity, our rights and our obligation as well. So it helps us to find our position in the international society. So I think the Vector issue is totally a great standout as a representative of Chinese science fiction authors.
Thank you so much, Stan. I also want to point out that apart from being an excellent writer himself, he is also an entrepreneur. So if you want to know more about his company, 传贸文化 or Team Maldi, and you can also look at the industry piece. And also let's welcome Emily.
Hi, so I'm also very honored to have contributed an article solely focusing on the translation of Chinese science fiction, which is often, I guess, a topic that people have focused on extensively, especially in the Anglophone world, because of the success of the three body problem. So as a, I guess, more or less emerging translator. Well, I guess not anymore because I'm now older. As someone who has closely followed the trend of Chinese science fiction, from it being more or less a domestic thing in a very small, rather marginalized community, following that from the perspective of a reader to now someone very immersed in the industry as both a translator and a scholar. I think it's great that I was able to trace this progress made in the article I wrote for Vector. And I think one thing that I want to also echo what Stan said is that now at this time, I believe that translation is something that we direly need in order to bridge the gaps between different people's understanding, because I think language is fundamentally about cognition, about the mind, about empathy, and translation is more or less the only way that we can try to get our points across different cultures to tell our stories to a greater audience. And now is exactly the time when we need that kind of interaction, that kind of communication. So I think to kind of boil all this down to one sentence, being able to write this article for Vector made me reflect intensely upon my own working as a translator from, I guess, like when you're buried in work, you kind of hardly have the chance to look back on what you've done and how it's been impacting people. But this article was a great chance for me to really get out of that perspective and view what's happening from kind of like a meta narrative way to reflect upon my own decisions made in the translation process and how my work is impacting people's reception of Chinese science fiction. Like, I do not mean to represent, but I think it's merely another perspective.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. And let's welcome Feng.
Thank you. Hi, I'm also honored to be invited to contribute an article to the Vector. And the article is about science fiction fandom in China. I'm talking about what's going on from a fan's perspective. And basically what I said in the article is that the history of Chinese science fiction was made by fans, because previously we don't have any professional writers, professional practitioners. It's only recent years when we had these kind of companies, entrepreneurs, and also inputs from the governments, right? So I talked about the fandom in China in terms of organizations, because we had national organizations, we have also local organizations organized by all fans. And also I talked about conventions, right? Because conventions is quite a phenomenon in China, in the landscape of Chinese science fiction. Previously, we don't have any, science fiction conventions before. We only had some conferences organized by Science Fiction World every year, right? But since like 5 to 6 years ago, we are having 4 to 5 national science fiction conventions every year. That's amazing. That's amazing. So these are the great gatherings for the science fiction writers, science fiction fans as well. So that's a phenomenon I want to point out as a very outstanding point of science fiction fandom in China. Also, I also introduced some prominent science fiction cultures in China. For example, we know that three-body problem is quite a phenomenal work in both in China and overseas. So there's a huge body of science fiction three-body fans. So they created a lot of fan culture products, like the animations, like the fan fiction, so on and so forth. So I used three-body fan products, fan cultures as an example to illustrate how the fans of China are so creative, and they are very eager to participate in the creation of science fiction cultures in China. So I basically introduced this fandom from those three perspectives. And what I'm also trying to add on is that I'm always saying that the history is made by the fans, and it's not until recently that the government and the capital are trying to input into the science fiction. So I'm trying to applaud for the achievements of science fiction fans in China, and I hope they can make better and better cultures in China. That's what I'm trying to say in my articles and here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we actually have a question from the audience. And if you have a question, feel free to put them there and we can kind of read them into the discussion. And this question is speaking directly to Feng, I believe, but actually connects to all. So what do you see as the major turning points in building the fandom and the industry? Can you give us more context? Thank you.
Yes, the turning point is, of course, the three-body problem. Three very critical points. One is the publication date of the third installment of the three-body, right? The Death's End. That was 2010, 2011, I remember. That is the time point when the science fiction is being seen by outside world, right? Previously it's only our small science fiction community where we talk about science fiction, where we talk to each other and we read the novels, so on and so forth. But it's after the 2011, it's when the outside world has the opportunity to observe, to find out that, there's a science fiction community in China, and there are a lot of great works written by science fiction writers in China as well. It's not that we are not, we exist. I mean, the community exists to the world, and also it's also a point where the science fiction fans are trying to, 2011, after that, science fiction fans are trying to organize, to voice out our achievements, our what we are doing, and what we're trying to broadcast to the outside world. So I remember it's the time point when the Association for Science Fiction, the Association for Chinese Science Fiction established, right? It's 2011, and since then the Chinese new Nebula Xingyun Awards were created, right? 2011. So since then it's been 12 times already. So that's the critical point. The first critical point. The second critical point is, of course, the 2016. It's when the three-body problem won the Hugo Awards, right? And now, since then, the science fiction not only has been seen by outside world, it has been valued by the whole world, by the readers, even by the top level, right? The central government has paid some attention to science fiction. So that's the point. 2016. And I remember it's after that we are receiving some governmental support, and also we have seen some science fiction fans turning into science fiction professionals, practitioners, because they received a lot of inputs from the capitals, and so the science fiction industry has becoming a phenomenon in China. These are the two critical points I want to point out. Maybe Regina and Stanley, you can add on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Feng. And this is very insightful. I believe when we are preparing for this vector issue, one thing the editors especially point out is what is Chinese science fiction industry, because it's such a unique concept. that I believe maybe it only exists in China, like we will consider it an industry. And like every like organization or company are interacting with the general thing in various formats and in various ways. Some of them, for example, are working on publishing. Some of them working on film adaptation, or like some education and writer cultivation. And some others are like more non-profit and just providing those opportunities for young writers and for fans to learn about science fiction. And also there, Chengdu is bidding for the WorldCon in 2023. This has been supported by their local government. And we can never imagine that, for example, like before 2015 or 16, it's never gonna be possible. Like if we go to some science fiction convention, it's just a small group of people. We had the time that we can all gather in a barbecue shop and eat barbecues and drink beers together with Da Liu, Dao Zu Shi, and all the big names. And these days, I feel like those parties have been upgraded to like banquets. You will see those buffet and people dressing in suit and working on red carpet. So it's no longer like, oh, we can just wear t-shirts and like just eat whatever we want. We have to like behave like a man.
So there's a question like, how does the international recognition of Chinese sci-fi, various Hugo Awards read by Obama, etc., affect what each of you do in China? Do you see a change in your day-to-day work when Chinese sci-fi became more popular internationally? To me, the answer is definitely yes, because China, or like in all these Asian countries, I think we have this kind of historical complex that something got popular or recognition from the West, it will be more like getting more attention domestically. So, for example, some directors, artists, musicians, where they got some huge awards internationally, they will become so popular back in China. So that's the same thing happened on Chinese science fiction as well. So after Three Body Problem won the Hugo Awards and also Food in Beijing. So I think and the whole industry, not only the film company, the investor, the government, and also the academic community, they all pay much more attention on science fiction in general. So there's so many events, like commercial events, like official events, maybe events in the university. They all love to have a science fiction writer to stand on the stage to talk about the future and the imagination. Because I think right now China is so concentrating on like how to develop our technology innovation power. So we put it in that like specific historical moment of geopolitically. So there's a conflict happen in a broader perspective. So now I think the government intend to think that there's certain connection between science fiction with the creativity. So I think they try to leverage science fiction as a way to educate and popularize the science knowledge or experience. So I think now it become the vibe and also a new fashion. Like we talk about science fiction, we talk about the future, and we have some science fiction writer as some kind of iconic characters on the stage or on the commercial advertisement, etc., you name it. So I think it's a good thing for us, for sure. But other thing is like, it might become some kind of burden because it might suck you up. There's so many opportunities there. You can make easy money, so to speak. So it might like cut your writing time off. You have to spend more time on this kind of events, talks, etc. But you have less time on writing. So that's one thing. And especially for those younger writers, it might become a huge, I'll say, illusion. Like you can become some celebrities overnight, but actually it's not true. So I think there's pros and cons there. So I really hope everyone can stay sober and be clear what our real identity and mission is, to create stories, amazing stories about China, about the whole human beings, but not to like be some, I don't know, celebrities or influencers on internet. So that's my thought.
Thank you so much, Stan. I also want to point out in the process of Chinese science fiction being recognized or being known by the world, translation is like an important part of it. So actually, like Emily, we'd like to know more about your work as a translator. Firstly, what kind of influences have you got because of all those like sudden attention from the global world to Chinese science fiction? And also in your own work, like how do you try to, in what ways do you communicate Chinese science fiction to the world in a proper way?
If you hear noise from my background, I will try my best to overcome this. Okay. So I guess like when I first saw this question, my immediate reaction is that without this international recognition of Chinese science fiction, my job would literally have not existed. Because the only reason that I'm able to be here and write articles and talk to all of you is because of the attention that translators are getting from the popularity that Chinese science fiction has won over the past decade on the global stage. So I guess to kind of give it a umbrella definition, what I feel that's happening in regards to translation is that right now, the amount of attention that we're getting internationally is both empowering, but also restraining. Empowering in the sense that with the awareness that we are going to be translated, that more people are reading our works, that we are essentially communicating not to a domestic audience, not even just to our little kind of previous marginalized small group of readers with their own niche in science fiction. We are talking to a lot of people out there with very wide range of backgrounds. So having that knowledge in mind, I think really helps us become more aware of the issues we can put into our works, for example. And for me as a translator, I think that awareness helps me think about, I guess, overcoming culture barriers and what's a better way to communicate the language and the concept into English, in my case, translating Chinese into English. So I think it helps me gain this meta perspective and reflecting upon my own work critically. But when I talk about restraining, that's another thing that we also, I guess, simultaneously have to be aware of, because this certain awareness can also become a burden to us people working in the industry as writers and as translators. Because, for example, you know for a fact that the Anglophone readers, they have a kind of expectation on Chinese literature and Chinese science fiction with this disproportional spike in popularity. A lot of people are seeing it as their only door into knowing what is Chinese fiction in general, what is contemporary China. And my view is always that I don't think this is a burden that we necessarily have to put on ourselves, because to boil all of this down, like what Sam said, it's all about writing good stories and being kind of having to somewhat fulfill that expectation, or even knowing that that kind of gaze exists on you, that you know that you're being examined as not just a writer, not just a science fiction writer, but as a Chinese writer, that awareness also to some extent can constrain you quite greatly. And I know that me as a translator in my work in the past, I have definitely grown very aware of the language I produce, whether I am intentionally or unconsciously participating in reinforcing those expectations, those cultural stereotypes. And I think in the past, I just do my best to struggle along, to hover between different ways of translating certain concepts and to try my best to represent my own language and my culture. But now I think the more mature I've gotten in terms of my work, the more I'm trying to put forth a, I guess, my own agenda as a translator, that we're also not just passive participants, that we're not just, I guess, invisible beings in between that can just translate seamlessly from one into another. But I think I do see translation as fundamentally a art, and that translators are actively participating in this process where it's basically like you and the original author are creating something whole new out of nowhere. So it's not just you're not just a filter, but you're also as crucial as a component in co-creating. And having worked with both Stan and Regina, who are both obviously very bilingual, this makes our work even more interesting because they can directly see my translation and point out the parts they like and they don't like. So having this kind of conversation, knowing that my authors have entrusted their work, their mind babies to me, but at the same time, we are also just constantly evolving together, talking about how to render things better. And they can also, I guess, like change the original in the English version to fit to what they want to talk to. And obviously them being bilingual and me acting in between as the mediator has made this process of translation very different from what you would normally expect. And also what's been done in the past, where it's essentially very linear. Like the original comes to translator produces the work and the author doesn't really look at it per se. So I think this international recognition to bring it back has fundamentally changed the ways in which writers and translators work together. I think we're definitely now a much more close-knit community. And especially because Chinese science fiction, the whole community is so young and also very contemporary, that our writers, they are very multilingual, multicultural. So I guess the real question is, when we speak about what is the Chineseness in Chinese science fiction, what we're really talking about is, what is Chineseness anyways? Do we have to necessarily represent China in one way or another? That our culture already comes with an international edge. Growing up reading works from America, from the UK, from Germany, having all that influence come together, do we still have to kind of represent the so-called, as we all know, the cliche authentic Chineseness? Can't we just be international and be okay with it? Isn't being international already a part of Chinese science fiction? So those questions are, I guess, like becoming more and more prominent as I work more in this field. And as a scholar, I am also trying to also keep a distance from my own work and try my best to evaluate what are the best ways to hone my skills as a translator, but also to see this thing kind of like as a general package from a larger perspective as a researcher.
Thank you so much, Emily. I can't agree more about what you said about translation. And I think like definitely like the close relationship between the translators and authors have played a big part in bringing Chinese science fiction abroad. I also know that another like group of people who have been historically underrepresented or unrecognized in Chinese science fiction are reviewers. And because like Feng, you have recently established this review platform, and like I don't think anything like that before existed in Chinese science fiction. Could you tell us more your thoughts about that?
Yes, I introduced myself as a critic. So I basically what I'm doing here is to read a lot of stories every year, and I also invite a lot of reviewers to read a lot of stories and contribute to the magazine review magazine. It's called a Nebula Science Fiction Review, And we are trying to, at the end of the year, we are trying to compile a list of recommended stories. And out of those recommended stories, I will try to select a few of them to edit year's best anthology. So on this point, I try to actually supplement what Stan just said about, he said that he's so busy right now because of so many opportunities. I'm just trying to say that it only happened to the top level authors or writers in Chinese science fiction, right? It's Da Liu and Stan and some Han Song and other very star writers out there. And for a large number of writers in China, they don't see this. They don't have this kind of opportunities to participate in a lot of activities, right? But they do see a lot of opportunities to publish their stories. So what I'm trying to say, second point is that despite the fact that the number of published stories increased every year very fast. So I can tell you the number of published short stories is more than 500 every year in China. But but the overall quality of these stories is questionable. So I just talked to Yao Haijun, an editor, a very senior editor in science fiction world, and he's also editing a year's best anthology every year. So we're like competitors, right? But we still talk to each other to find out what kind of stories he will select and what kind of stories I will select. And we had a talk just a few weeks ago. We agreed that in 2020. The stories, we are not satisfied with the quality of the stories we read, right? And Yao, Mr. Yao just even said that he thought about quitting editing the year's best anthology because he used to be a peasant who collect the best of the best, but he found that there's no best of the best, and so we reached some consensus that even if the publication or the market publishers or the markets are growing, but the ability to write good stories for the writers, also the editing abilities of the new editors for the new markets, they are not catching up. So what I'm as a critic, as a reviewer, also as an editor, I try to I urge our new writers. I try to urge them not to look at those top opportunities, right? They need to work on their craft of writing. They need to write some good stories. These are the base for our Chinese science fiction development. So that's all I want to add.
And continuing what Feng has just said, there are more authors publishing and in more platforms. So Stan, I know that in the recent years, you have been publishing more and more outside of the science fiction market. For example, the mainstream literature market, they are also interested in science fiction, and you've been working with them a lot. And also you've got the opportunity to work with Dr. Kai-Fu Li. Could you share us more about the experience of publishing in different markets towards different audience of your own writing?
Thanks, Regina. Yes, I think there's a big trend of demands on science fiction across different media. For example, in China, we have fashion media as Critique and also GQ, those fashion magazines. So they also have this kind of a special issue on future romance or future fashion, etc. So they might need some perspective from science fiction writers. So they'll have some features inviting some science fiction writers to contribute some pieces. And also, meanwhile, there's huge interest from mainstream literature magazines like 收获、人民文学、十月, etc., etc. So those are used to be made and majorly focus on mainstream literature and poems, etc. But now they also like continuously deliver this kind of science fiction special feature like every year. So I think, but still they have this kind of maybe stereotype on what science fiction should looks like. So there must be something, some elements, some factors, science fictional. So maybe there's, sometimes we try to submit something even more slipstream, even more like ambiguous on genre, but they'll tell you this might not be the science fiction we want. But meanwhile, they ask for like a very high level of like literacy. So for example, the style, the description, the character, etc. So I think they are not totally in the picture of what science fiction it is now, but still on the like a previous image of like 80s or 90s science fiction style of China. So I think it needs some time to educate them, to open up their mindset, because we know right now we have so many diverse style, subgenres, and also writers there, but we try really hard to push them to be on the stage, because there are so many young authors like Regina. You're one of them, but you're already established because you are from like pretty much mainstream literature background, I'll say, from Fudan University. So I think they'll take you as one of them. But others, like will say, is like organic growth writers. They might got very hard to get into this community and very hard to have their work being seen. So also like Sanfeng said, like right now we try to have this kind of young authors have this better environment, better situation to write something they really want to write, something belong to themselves, but not to chasing after some kind of commercialized something like LuXun style science fiction, which is quite highly like recommended by the film company and also the investors. But we all know that it's impossible, right? Because you couldn't be the next LuXun, even you try to copycat all his stuff, all his style. So I think the better way is like we try to create this friendly environment to encourage everyone to have their own voice. But the process might be long, because we need to have this kind of conversation with all these editors, with these publishers, with this also film companies. I think it takes time, but I can see it's like slowly making progress.
Thank you so much, Stan. I myself had a time struggling in between science fiction and mainstream. And you know, those people, they have different aesthetics and different expectations of like science fiction stories. That I want to like follow this question about like Western expedition towards Chinese science fiction. So Emily, could you share with us more about like during your translation work and the communicating with English editors, like do they have such kind of stereotypes?
First of all, counter censorshiping is a thing that I do definitely see that when working with a lot of editors, especially editors who are not as familiar with science fiction, but more like mainstream publishers in English, they really do want to see a certain image of China represented. And that's also like what I said previously, I think a lot of people in the Anglophone world, their only exposure to Chinese contemporary literature is through science fiction. So since that's their only point of access, they would naturally expect disproportionately from science fiction writers, just for the sheer volume of science fiction being translated versus other contemporary Chinese literature. So I think because of this, people often want to see too much of China through Chinese science fiction and too little of the science fiction or the stories themselves, which is quite unfortunate. So I think the only way for us to overcome that is to really still up the volume of Chinese literature being translated in general, science fiction and beyond. So in this way, when the pool is bigger, people have a lot more to choose from. They can also just follow their favorite authors based on style and not because of whether the author is Chinese or not. So I think as a cap, the unique combination of China plus technology, I know it hits a lot of people's like sweet spot in the Anglophone world because that's all they want to see about China. But science fiction, we have to first acknowledge that it is in itself an imaginary, a speculative, a literary genre beyond just being kind of like some kind of future prophecy or some kind of, oh, this is like insight into China. So this is my view in general, and I'm still positive about moving forward. I think it's just that we have to do more work together in general, as writers, as translators, and as editors doing these kind of international exchanges. So eventually we'll get to a better place.
Thank you so much. And I think we have another question about what are the subgenres that are popular in China. And since Feng, you are also doing those database and keep a track of all the stories published in Chinese. So could you give a quick answer to it, and then we can move to the final recommendation part?
Yes. In terms of number of published stories or books, it's the AI. The AI theme is the most popular theme in Chinese science fiction, right? In terms of the sales, of course, there's only one subgenre. It's Da Liu's Liu Zixin subgenre, who had the highest the highest sale numbers. Yeah. So I think these are the two subgenres I would like to say most popular in China. Yes. Very short answer.
Thank you so much. And now let's move to the final questions. And when looking at the history of science fiction writing in China, who should we be looking for books from, like beyond or before Liu Zixin? And also, like, who are the writers that are publishing now that we should be looking for in the next 5 years? So we can like give an answer like two-way, like in the past and in the future.
I think there are so many emerging writers we can look into. And I think, for example, 七月 in English is supposed to be translated as July. So it's a confusing name, I'll say. But his novel, The Stars, is, I think, one of the best Chinese science fiction in maybe 5 years or even longer. So I'll say there's some new female authors like Mu Ming, Shuang Chi Mu, and etc. So they all bring the new freshy style into the genre. So now I think Emily and Regina, they co-editing an anthology of Chinese female science fiction is about to be published by Tor maybe next year.
And as I mentioned just now, Regina and I are co-working on a project that works on giving more exposure to science fiction writers who are female or non-binary, who have not been previously translated, a lot of them. So I think just look out for our anthology that will be publishing in the year 2022, called The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories.
Yes, I would like to recommend another female writer. She's very low key, Shi Hui. Yeah, she is now an editor in Science Fiction World. She has been writing science fiction for like more than 15 years already, and she has published a few novels and several dozens of stories. Many of them are very great. And one of her novels is titled 2030 End Time. And I think it's one of the best novels in recent 5 or even 10 years, 5 years. It's published in 2017 or 18. I still say it's the best novel I have seen for the last 5 years. And I recommended this novel to the publisher the publisher who brought the three-body problem to the Western world, right? The Chinese education import company, I forgot their full name, and they loved it, and they will try to publish this novel in English sometime soon. So I recommend you guys to look for her stories. Yeah. She also had some short stories published in the Western markets.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Just quickly, in addition to the female anthology, female and non-binary actually anthology, Emily and Stan mentioned that will be coming out in English next year. There are two other anthologies in Chinese, like dedicated to all female science fiction authors. And one of them is actually edited by Stan. It's a 4-volume anthology, including like the major female authors. And another one is edited by Chen Qiufan, and it's kind of gives a historical background. So she's collecting like authors writing from the 1980s to today. So they are also a showcase of Chinese science fiction female authors. And thank you all so much for this amazing panel. And check out more information on Essence of Wonder, or like all our panelists' Twitter about Chinese science fiction and other exciting news. And see you next time.
Thank you so much. And so it's so exciting. We have Regina with us both in the video and in the flesh today. So we'll get to some of the questions that we've had asked in the panel or during the recording just a little bit later, but I wanted to bring in Yen, who is going to be moderating our second panel here. How are you doing, Yen?
Thanks, Karen. Just thinking about all the stuff that the first panels brought up again. I mean, even though I sat in for the recording, it's just a lot of fantastic stuff there.
It really was, and I'm adding things to my reading list as they were brought up. Especially the last, the phrase, the best novel I've encountered in the last 5 years is a compelling.
Very compelling, definitely.
Point.
Yeah. Well, hopefully all this kind of energy and interest will, make sure that publishers will publish more translated fiction in the future as well.
Absolutely, it's hard to imagine people being more excited about a new work and a new culture that a work has come from than the three-body problem. And I think the point that's really sort of opened doors for more writing is also very much something I see, and I'm excited to keep seeing.
Definitely.
Would you like to introduce your panelists? Or?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Karen. Today with me we have three people who are very established in Chinese science fiction in their own way. And I've met all of them at one point or another in my Chinese science fiction exploration. And we have Guangzhao Lyu. I should pronounce his name properly. And we have Xueting Christine Ni and also Angus Stewart. Let's see if they are, I just want to make sure that they are here. Yes, I see them now. Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have everyone, this panel here today. And as Regina mentioned, the previous panel was recorded because it was with panelists who are in Asia. So we didn't want to keep them up too long, and we didn't want to have them up in the wrong time frame. So we split this into two panels, and all the panelists we have here today are in Europe, which makes things a little bit easier. I will just say a little bit about myself, just to give you an introduction, and then I will pass on to the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll have a really good conversation, I hope. Thank you so much. Okay, so my name is Yen, and I was one of the co-guest editors for the Vector issue that you have heard a lot of in the first panel, and I'm gonna hold this up right now just to see if you can see it a little bit. This Vector issue, Regina and I were very lucky to have been called in to co-guest edit this Vector issue, which is a special issue on Chinese SF. And if you join the British Science Fiction Association now, up to the end of May, you can still get a copy of.
Oh,
we just lost audio.
you accidentally muted, I think.
Oh, okay.
But I realized that as you got to brag about your panelists, nobody's quite bragged about you yet. So I wanted to just add a few other things about your work.
Okay, sure.
That you were also an author of both. I guess a narrative director is more the right term for Road to Guangdong, which is a narrative-style driving game, but that you also have both a novel and a collection of, I should say, a suspicious collection of short stories and poetry, which is an amazing name for a collection, as well as a novel called Sun, Queens of Earth available. So
thank you.
Quite a body of work also.
Thank you so much. I'll just give a little brief kind of idea of my journey into Chinese SF so that our audience here kind of knows why I came into it in the first place, I guess. As Karen said, I'm a writer myself, so I read a lot, and I've been reading since childhood, and I love SF. I came to science fiction really late in the day. You know, usually when people come to it in the teens or maybe young adult phase. I actually came to it in my 30s and fell in love with science fiction in that way. And one of the things that happened, I think this was around 2014, was I read a book called The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet by Vandana Singh. And there's a collection of short stories by this Indian sci-fi writer. And I absolutely fell in love with it and just thought to myself, did anyone do any of this for Chinese sci-fi? You know, like I would love to read things, stories like this that represent the culture that I know, the culture that I grew up with. That was my journey into trying to find more Chinese sci-fi and also write Chinese speculative fiction myself to kind of bring more representation in. And that was how I got to meet Xueting, because one of the first things we did together was a Chinese sci-fi panel at the London Book Fair way back when, and then, sorry, not London Book Fair, Nine Worlds way back when. I think this was 2016. And then I got to meet Angus a few years later, and together we met Stanley Chen Qiufan as well. That was fantastic, wasn't it? It was a really, really good symposium in Leeds that we joined together. And that was where I met Angus. And then I also met Guangzhao because he runs the fantastic, let me get this right, London Chinese Science Fiction Group. And they do, it's like a book group, and they get together, once a month to kind of read and stuff. And again, the breadth of knowledge that groups like this bring, I think is amazing in Chinese science fiction. So from the start of my journey, way back in 2014 till now, everything has just grown and blown up year by year. And it's really, really fantastic to see so much more engagement and so much more writing available in Chinese science fiction today. And on that note, I want to pass on to Xueting to just do a little bit of introduction of herself and also maybe comment on the Vector issue, what she read from there, and whether she had any comments or thoughts on it as well. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Xueting. I'm a culture commentator, writer, and translator. I've been doing it for about 10 years, writing extensively on different aspects of traditional and pop culture of China and its place in the West. My latest book, which is called Synopticon, a collection of translated Chinese science fiction, is out in November this year, published by Rebellion. I loved looking through Vector and found pieces such as the one on Chinese women's SF tradition, particularly informative, but it was all very interesting.
Thank you, Xueting. If we can go to Angus, please, for your introduction and your thoughts.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Angus. I'm probably here because I'm the host of a podcast called the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast, something I started about a quarter or a third of a way through a master's degree in publishing I did about 2 years ago now, which is a scary thought. The dissertation I did for that degree was also on Chinese science fiction specifically. It was called Sci-Fi Sendoutism, Reform and Opening, a study of new wave Chinese science fiction's journey to the West. And the reason I'm able to rattle that off is a printed out version is sitting in front of me. It's a bit of a mouthful of a title. The Vector issue, I was able to read it, and yeah, it was kind of ticks the big box I'd be looking for when I'm reading and trying to stay up to date and abreast of what's going on in Chinese science fiction, be it translated into English, which is kind of where I've always concerned myself, or not. And that the big box is the like holisticness. So there's perspectives from authors, translators, academics, and maybe most importantly, just there's a reader's sort of review of the books as well. Neil Harrison's review. Sort of an outside perspective, because the thing in translated lit is the people who want to talk about it most are like the people who are interested or are experts, but the perspectives that matter most from at least a commercial point of view are the readers. So it's important not to have like the bubble, be stuck in the bubble, but also like you got David Derwei Wang in there. It's amazing. So some of, again, sort of a perspective from the literary academic world, but he's a guy who's interested in genre fiction as well. So it's awesome that we're able to get insights from him. And he's probably one of the dream guests for my podcast. So I like to think if you can get him into Vector, maybe I can get him on my show, but who knows?
Thank you, Angus. And last but not least, can we have Guangzhao, please, for your introduction? Thank you.
Hello, hi Ian. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I don't know why I can be here, but assumingly I'm one of the boring academic. I'm currently a PhD student in comparative literature at UCL, University College London. And apart from that, yeah, like Ian has introduced briefly before, I am the organizer of the London Chinese Science Fiction Reading Group. Yeah. I can't even get the name right, so sorry about that. So, yeah, so the good news for this is we just have a website for our reading group, for our association, whatever you like to call. So I just put in the link in the chat box. So if you are interested in what our project, our previous reading group sessions, and our future plans, so you can have a look at the website. So the website was established by my friend, who is also an organizer of the group. It's called she is Angela, so probably some of you knows her, right? So yeah, that's my my work about London Chinese Science Fiction Reading Group. Yeah, like Angus podcast, that was also established like 2 years ago in 2019 in April, exactly 2 years ago. Yeah, it's horribly fast how the time flies actually. So we have a 2 years birthday for the most recent session. We're going to have Han Song to be the guest. That would be a fantastic, I would say. So yeah, so you can sign up the newsletters, or yeah, keep an eye on the website or something like that. And yeah, apart from this, I also have a cooperation with the research communities, like the London Science Fiction Research Community, LSFRC. Yeah, I don't know why people get complicated names. And also I got cooperation with the Science Fiction Research Association, SFRA, based in the States. Yeah, so pretty much that is me. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Guangzhao. You're all here for a reason, is that, you know, you're all very much experienced and involved in Chinese science fiction, I think. And I think all of you point out a really important point in the vector issue is that the vastness of information in there. I think it's really interesting. One of the things that Regina and I, and together with the BSFA vector editors, found was that we actually couldn't fit everything that we wanted to fit in there. So there are articles that are going to be online only, and you feel free to go onto the vector website and have a look at those as well. And what this shows us is that Chinese sci-fi is not just about one thing or a way of looking at it. It is an entire industry, as we heard in the first panel, where it is big enough to hold its own. And it is also vast in all manners of genre perspectives, tropes, understanding, the list can go on and on. So what I think is really nice for all of us who work in Chinese sci-fi is that we have so much to talk about that is always different and always keeps us on our toes. And if you have any questions at all in the audience, please put it in the chat and we will get to it as we discuss. There are already a few questions there from Flory, and I actually want to kick off with one of Flory's questions for now, and that is about the question of genre. So Flory says, talk is mostly about science fiction as linked to science and progressive ideas and technology. But how are the other branches of speculative fiction, like fantasy, etc., perceived and published in China? And for this question, I want to start with Xueting, because Xueting's knowledge about pop culture in China is fantastic. So I think she's, the perfect person to answer this question. Xueting?
Thank you, Yan. So I happen to have just written an essay on China's internet literature a short while ago, and it's similar to Chinese science fiction. I think fantasy and other speculative fiction is still carries the stigma of not being literary in China, although things are changing. There is, I think this was mentioned in lecture as well, there is a debate within academia of whether to see internet literature, which really, really helped the development of a lot of fantasy genres, not just sci-fi, but things like xianxia, qihua, xuanhuan, and other. So that's xianxia, a fantasy involving immortals and gods, qihua, which combines Western and Eastern fantasy, and then xuanhuan, which is more Eastern-based fantasy, just to give you a few examples. So internet literature that really helped to develop these genres. The debate in academia is about whether to see these literature to study it as literature or something else. And I think it's very interesting that there is that debate because, well, it seems like it very much is literature, a type of literature, but there is, going back to, there is the same type of stigma about whether this is literary writing, whether this is worth studying or worth reading to a lot of mainstream readers. Going back to sci-fi, it's only recently that, so science fiction in China grew out of the fanzines, the academic, so fans in academia, and them forming communities and groups and publishing things in fanzines. It was very kind of niche. And it's only until recently, after a few key critical moments, like LuXun winning his Hugo Award, and then Hao Jingfang winning hers, that sci-fi has really beginning to come into the mainstream. And I think for other types of speculative fiction, this is happening too, in that the internet literature, which is already, we're seeing a lot of them being adapted into other forms like films and TV series, then achieving a lot of success and that and profitability within industry, and that is really feeding into the view, the attitude, changing the attitude towards these types of speculative fiction. So, for example, we are platforms are being established at universities and courses to study internet literature, and certain writers, certain key writers are becoming members of the Chinese Writers Association and participating in kind of the overall dialogue of Chinese writers, and some of their works are being studied academically. So yes, there is a similar kind of thing happening to other types of speculative fiction as science fiction in China, but attitudes are starting to change.
Thanks, Xueting. I think it's really interesting that there's so much of, I guess, I mean, because I'm an academic myself, we call it the digital humanities that's happening. So things that are happening on the internet, on media, you know, through media and stuff like that, that maybe traditional literary specialists are unable to grasp as well, especially in terms of how popular something can get overnight. So it's really, really great to hear that there is so much interest, that the other genres and the thinking around speculative fiction is beginning to change, and that it's all slowly taking off in that sense. That's brilliant. Thank you. Angus, actually, on your podcast, you have different seasons, and each season comes with a theme. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that in terms of how that fits into kind of genres and maybe how you picked them?
Sure. Yes. So generally on my show, I don't hold to any kind of schedule, and I don't organize the entire thing by seasons. I do it sort of episode by episode, but twice now, or 3 times if you include upcoming episodes, I've sort of organized a little run of episodes all in one theme, or in the past 2 cases, all in one genre, and that's been a season. So the first one I did was sci-fi season, and I felt confident enough to do that after the event that me, yourself, and Guangzhao went to in Leeds, because basically I just met Chen Qiufan and Xia, and I was like, they both were like, yeah, we'll come on the show. And then Guangzhao had said he'd be happy, so that was 3. That's the makings of a block of episodes. So the 2 seasons I've done so far are sci-fi season and wuxia season, and the 3rd one coming up is Taiwan season. So obviously that's not a genre, so I won't talk so much about that one. Sci-fi was sort of my comfort zone. That was one of the first 3 pieces of translated Chinese fiction I read were Diary of a Madman by LuXun, which is really foundational to modern Chinese lit, and that's basically literary fiction, although you could argue it's speculative. Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Lo Meng, which is one of the 4 classics, not so modern, and then The 3-Body Problem, the whole trilogy. And that's the one that really grabbed me. So with the sci-fi season, I knew what I was doing for the most part, and it kind of was a nice little sequel to my dissertation that I'd done. With the wuxia season, I was going in much more blind, and to be honest, going into something I'm less excited about reading, but something I knew was going to be really important, at least from like a reader, like the, not just a publishing perspective, but like just the literary landscape, because it's got a strong offline and online presence. It is one of the cases of some modern Chinese pop culture which has successfully transmitted or spread to, I don't know about the rest of the world because I'm not from the entire world, but certainly the Western world. Maybe people don't know the word wuxia, but if you sort of describe its aesthetics, they'll know what you're talking about, if only because they've seen like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon or something. So I was expecting to not know what to expect, but I was expecting to find quite a marginal genre. But I think what I learned from it is that the margins can actually be thicker than the mainstream. If you visualize like a square, in Photoshop. I don't know what that means to people, where the thickness of the edge is, is, if you take all the, it's a strange metaphor, but if you take all the space on the edge, you'll have more readers than the people reading the stuff which is supposedly mainstream, which is easier to come across. So yeah, I was kind of blown away with how popular the wuxia season was and how interested people were. But also it was just a very smart sort of from a business perspective from my show, because it was a totally different group of readers and listeners and translators and writers that it let me connect with. So yeah, I felt that there's maybe, I don't know, it's hard for me to say which overlaps more with mainstream literary, like book reading, Chinese, translated Chinese sci-fi or wuxia. I'd probably say sci-fi, because these days there's a lot of translated Chinese sci-fi books, like physical print books out there. But with wuxia, there are some out there, but it's more of a scattering. And I'm gonna, just for participants who aren't so up on like what translated Chinese sci-fi they can buy, I've made a Google Doc where I've tried to list all the books out there, although I probably missed some. So I'm just going to end by dropping that link in the group chat. There you go. Okay, now I'll shut up.
Thank you, Angus. Yeah, I mean, wuxia has a lot of brilliant, I think, TV from it. And Xueting has probably mentioned, well, I'm sure Xueting has mentioned it on Twitter, in her various writing and stuff like that. Xueting, is there any specific wuxia series that you would recommend for anyone who's interested in finding out more about that?
For wuxia, so can I just, there's a question about wuxia, sort of heroic fantasy.
Yeah, go for it.
Answer that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So wuxia is what commonly is known as kung fu fantasy or martial arts fantasy. It features usually a historical setting, but not necessarily, usually most of the time, swordsmen who interact with civilian society, but they're also part of this thing called jianghu, this community where there are rules, but the rules are different from normal society, and they're all kind of masters of kung fu, and it's the stories about these people, and I'm sure you've seen some, if not read, you've seen some Chinese kung fu films that can be classified as wuxia. And now going back to Yen's question about what's currently a good wuxia series to watch, everybody seems to be talking about Word of Honor, which is adapted from, which you can find on things like Youku, unfortunately not on one of the Western platforms, but there are fan-subbed versions out there, and also on YouTube. And it's a wuxia series adapted from the novelist Priest's novel, the author known as Priest. But the genre has been going on for, like, the modern version of the genre has been going on for decades, since the 1950s, but the genre itself goes back, has its roots in kind of imperial Chinese history, so going back to as far as the 7th century, the Tang legends, and that's it starts all the way back there and gradually evolved into how we know wuxia novels today. And of course, the absolute major figure in modern wuxia is Yong, and I think many of us have grown up with his works. Because he's from mainland China, but he lived outside of mainland China and therefore had a lot of productions from like Hong Kong or Taiwan. I think he's quite well known throughout the diaspora as well as inside mainland China. And now he's becoming known around the world because his works are getting translated. I think started a few years ago, Condor Heroes. There are 2 translators working on it at the moment, Gigi Chang and Anna Holmes. And yeah, so before I go on for too long, I just wanted to say that it's been compared to, Wuxia has been compared to Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, very much in the West. Whilst I can see the similarities, I would say it's a lot more similar, a lot more akin to sort of the Marvel and DC universe of superheroes. Perhaps I should let you read the novels and watch the series so you can see for yourself.
Thank you, Xueting. Now that's a really interesting thing to mull over that you've left us with. Is it more akin to the superheroes or not? It'll be great to kind of take this conversation to another degree, I think. And seeing as we're on Chinese sci-fi, I'm going to bring us a little bit back to Chinese sci-fi specifically now. And Guangzhao, I actually want to put Florie's other question to you. So Florie said, were Chinese SF confined to YA smaller publications before 2016? And was that when it reached adulthood, when companies started to get launched focusing on Chinese SF? And just to add on top of that, because the one of the Sorry, I keep getting muted. I don't know why. Okay. And one of the things I wanted to add is in the Vector issue, one of the big highlights is obviously the concept of the Chinese sci-fi industry. And for someone like yourself who have taken the decision to come over to the UK to do your PhD here, can you give us an idea of what drove you to make this decision, and how the studies of Chinese sci-fi is compared to, in China as well as here, in the industry perspective, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much for posing that question to me. Personally, I'm not that familiar with the what happens in the industry, but what I can say something about the people's understanding of the Chinese science fiction as the YA literature or young adult for children, for scientific popularization, that kind of stuff. I think it's more like the way in which people understand science fiction stories, like. Because if we look at the science fiction works themselves, I don't see any of the, or I can't see any of the, but most of the science fiction published probably in the 90s, at the first decade of so-called Chinese New Wave. I think many of those stories are not targeted at the children, or many of the stories got very interesting historical references and very interesting political references as well. So they're talking about the society. They're talking about the cultural shift from, what happened in the so-called post-socialist transitions in China during the 90s and onwards. So they got lots of direct response or historical response, cultural response to that historical transition. So I think it's more like the way why people think science fiction as a part of the young adult literature, and part of the literature that should really focus on the science part, right? On the science part instead of the fiction part. I think that kind of understanding can date back to a few decades before, like in the 70s and the 80s, where when China was hugely influenced by the Soviet Union, and especially the very concept, the very notion of science fiction, and the Chinese translation of science fiction as 科幻小说 or 科学文艺 is a kind of a 科学文艺 is a science, art, and literature. So you can see it's more targeted on the science itself. So that kind of understanding was have some historical connection to Soviet Union, and especially to the, I think, part of the structuralism, and that is part of the Russian stuff. And so that is why people, especially during the 80s, around 83 or 82 back then. So I think there's a very important debate about whether science fiction is about science or about fiction. So that's very interesting. And back then there are actually so. But it's a long story. It's a long story. Long story short, I just say the result is the kind of the sign. The people support science. They won the debate. So that's why I think during the decades, especially before the so-called new wave comes in, then people believe that science fiction is more about the science and it's for the popularization of the scientific knowledge, especially to children. Especially we have some. Understanding the science fiction is to help children develop their interest or inspiration about the scientific studies and stuff. So that is a stereotype, I would say. And also the stereotype got the reason, and the reason needs to be interrogated, of course. But that is all about the history. And so that's why I think if we understand, especially in China or in the Chinese discourse, we understand science fiction as a young adult literature. It's more about still that kind of understanding comes in to influence how you understand the literature, but it's not the literature or it's not the stories themselves. The stories themselves are they are diverse. Especially, some of the stories are definitely for the children to read, but others are not. Others are certainly not for children. So that's why there's a general. I think it's kind of on the a general level how people understand science fiction as a genre is how we see it. It's not what it is. So that's how I see this. Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Guangzhao, for the small history lesson as well as your perspective of that. And I think it's really important that we understand that historically a lot of literature, whether it's from China or from elsewhere, gets developed with the influences of a lot of the countries around them, the media that's available, the socio-political movements, all sorts of stuff comes into play. And it's easy for us to just stick to one concept of it and run with it. But there's actually a lot that needs to be looked at. And I think you highlight a lot of the issues in there quite well. Thank you. Would you be all right to continue with the question of, so considering the industry, what got you over to the UK for studies, and how does it look like in terms of the PhD or academic platform in China and the academic platform in the UK?
Well, actually, that's what I'm trying to do, especially to quite recently, it's very interesting. Quite recently, I talked to one of the science fiction scholars in China, and we sort of trying to set up an online journal on Chinese is kind of science fiction studies in China. So we are trying to set up begin that kind of online journal in that way. And we have this very interesting conversation on the Chinese studies on Chinese science fiction overseas, that is beyond the China mainland. And we go, because you are the one of the scholars, I can't say boring scholars, but one of the interesting scholars yourself. And you certainly know that there are lots of papers on Chinese science fiction published by the scholars based in the States, based in Canada or Australia. I can think of a few names in that way, but probably not that many in the UK. So that's from my limited literature review. So I can't see that many in the UK. So we kind of think that the Chinese science fiction comes a bit late in the academia for the British scholars, but we are trying to begin that kind of journey. I think you got lots of ideas in that way as well. So we have, because I know science fiction in many ways can be understood as some kind of a world literature. But still, when we think of science fiction as a world literature, we still have to focus on the locality. That is, when we read about Chinese science fiction, we read Chinese science fiction like based in the UK, right? And scholars based in UK, they got some understanding of the Chinese science fiction, and the American scholars, they got some understanding of the Chinese science fiction as well. So we have to think about the locality of the Chinese science fiction studies. The people in the UK, certainly they got different understanding of the same stories compared to their counterpart in the North America and in Canada. So we have to send out that kind of voice. We have to let people know how British writers, how British scholars understand Chinese science fiction as a genre. That kind of logic can stay in the other way as well. How Chinese scholars read British science fiction as well. So because I am based in the comparative literature, and I can think of a few years back when I just came in, I met the kind of induction session by the head of the department, and she said to us that we are all the comparative scholars, right? We're all in the comparative literature, and what does it mean by comparative? So that is a very interesting question. What does it mean by comparative? In my case, what does it mean by the comparison between Chinese and British science fiction in the recent 30 years, I think. So what she said is really inspiring to at least myself back then. She said, this is a question about how to read one thing from the other. In my case, that's how to read Chinese science fiction from the perspective of the UK, and in the other way around, how we read British science fiction, especially what I'm working on at the Ian Banks, right, and China Mieville, how Chinese people like me read these writers from the Chinese perspective, and how we read Chen Qiufan, how we read LuXun and Regina, Regina Kanyu, right, how we read those stories from the British perspective. So that is very interesting, for me, But I don't think I answered that question about the industry perspective, because I am not that familiar to the industry, so sorry about that. So that part is basically from the boring academic perspective. So yeah.
No, that's really interesting, because I think academia is also a part of the industry, whether the academics want to believe in it or not. we are a part of the bigger industry. And it does bring me to the next question, which I will ask you first, and then I will pass on to the others as well. So in the first panel, Emily, the translator, made a really good point, which is because Chinese science fiction is still quite new in the world, and it's kind of the leading genre of literature coming out from China that the world is seeing right now. The readers of Chinese science fiction in English, in the Anglophone world, has an expectation of reading China in Chinese science fiction. They want to see a certain perspective in there. And I address it in the Vector, in my Vector opening, the editorial piece, because, it is so common for us who work in Chinese science fiction to have people come up and say, oh, that piece is about politics and that piece is about the government. And it gets boring after a little while, because there is so much more to Chinese science fiction that we want, people to see. So Emily says, people want to see China in Chinese science fiction, but there's so much more. And my question, which I will ask you first, and then I'll ask the others, is, from your personal perspective, what do you want people to see in Chinese science fiction? Or what's your favorite bits in Chinese science fiction, if it's easier?
Yeah, what I want to see from Chinese science fiction is just science fiction itself. So it's not about Chinese. I would say the Chinese, there's part of the, I think the question is part of the question is about the translation industry, right? So I know, it's just rather fortunately and unfortunately at the same time, the translation, especially the translation of Chinese science fiction stories, is still very market oriented. So we have to think about what about the market, and especially publishers, they got some kind of really practical concerns of this. So that is totally understandable. But in that way, so we can see the stories translated into English have some, it's not that neutral, right? So you got the reader's expectation, the reader's acceptance in that way. So it's not completely neutral. So what you can see from the English versions of the Chinese stories, they are probably not that much Chinese anymore. So we got some, differences here, in between. And what we can see is, I would say that Chinese science fiction is still part of science fiction. And if it just happens to be in China, and if it is in China, so we certainly got some Chinese perspective in that, but you can't read the story just to read the Chinese part. So that is I think this is less neutral if we think that way. So yeah, okay.
That's great, thank you. So you want the world to see science fiction, and I think that's a really, really important thing. And I will pass the question on now to Xueting. What do you think, Xueting? What, as a translator yourself as well, what would you like the stories that you translate and the stories that you write and the stories that are in the market right now? What do you want people to kind of read from there?
I think first and foremost, as a translator and writer, I would like them to appreciate Chinese science fiction from an intellectual and aesthetic value, as as enjoyable stories, interesting, speculative, that create interesting speculative worlds. But yes, there is a huge tendency to read China in Chinese science fiction, which seems to be the biggest window at the moment. And I'm very glad for this window, because I grew up with the English literary canon and got into sci-fi like during my university days. And when I started translating, like after university, it was from the UK, certainly, and probably to some extent around other parts of the West, the window into China used to be very kind of high literary fiction, focused on various events of 20th century Chinese history, and that was it. And so I'm really glad to have that the world now has this new window to see China through. And as a writer, because I'm a culture writer and commentator, so I'm more than happy to explain China to people through my writing and I'm always translating with this in mind. I'm happy to write guides and footnotes, etc. So I think it's a very positive thing. Can you read about a large civilization, a nation, through an individual's work? Does that sum up the whole civilization? No, it doesn't. But does it give you an understanding of it, or from a perspective, from a certain angle or perspective, or on a certain theme, or does it give you an insight into the nation's preoccupations? Yes, it does. So I think, so there is also a tendency of Western readers sometimes of certain Western readers to read Chinese science fiction as some sort of political narrative. So, for example, is it about oppression, oppressive state mechanisms, or about complicity in that? I think, Yen, you mentioned that in your intro, which I found really interesting. So there is a tendency to do that, and I think I would like people to. So, of course, China is a very outward-looking. Modern China is a very outward-looking nation. The Chinese are interested in all sorts of things around the world. So what Chinese writers write, are going to be influenced by these things, as well as what's happening inside China. But on the other hand, I hope that people can look beyond the kind of political events into to appreciate the stories for what they are.
That's great. Thank you, Xueting. And before I pass the same question on to Angus, I'm going to make it a little bit harder for him because I'm going to. So recently, I sat in for a talk with a film director who's a Singapore film director who works a lot with the film industry in China itself. And what he said was really interesting when he talked about films coming out of China trying to make it in the international or global screens. He said that people don't want to see stories that have lives that are the same as theirs when they go and see a Chinese film. So they want to see that it's different. And in a way, because it's entertainment, I can understand that we go and watch a horror film to be horrified. We go and watch, an alien film to find out things about new aliens or let our imaginations run. And there is a sense that people watch or consume media or entertainment from China for something specific. So I'm going to pass the question now on to Angus. I know it makes it a little bit harder, but from your perspective, especially because you deal with a lot of readers as well as the writers, and your audience is actually in the UK. What would you like people to understand or see in Chinese science fiction, and what's your kind of takeaway on the podcasts that you've done based on this?
Okay. Right. To answer the first question, I really don't know so much about cinema, Chinese cinema, or international cinema. I know a bit about like film studies, but yeah. So all I could say is like just a boring answer that for like just from a purely commercial perspective, I think any foreign language film that's going to make it to like English language cinemas would probably need some extra sort of oomph to make it survive in market conditions versus other movies, be that French or German, but it's probably, going to be even harder for a Chinese film for sure. Like a Chinese like slice of life drama, I think if you, again, not using the logic of an ideal world, but just the logic of where's that thing likely to be accepted, probably like a film festival or something. I watched a really nice one at Berlinale Film Festival years ago called Einstein, about a girl who gets a dog and is like helps her get by being bullied by her dad, and like there were plenty of specifically Chinese things in that movie. It was just a slice of life, but I haven't seen it anywhere outside of that one film festival screening at Scott, which is a shame, but like that's reality. Maybe there'll come a time when reality will be more accommodating to that sort of movie, but I don't know. I don't know much about cinema. What would I like to see? Probably, as far as Chinese sci-fi is concerned, I don't want the wave to break. I want these books to continue to be rights to be bought for translation. I want them to continue to be published. I'd like to see more readers read them, more critics go mad for them. And I know we don't love Joe Biden as much as we love Obama, but when the next 3 body comes along, if they could get put on the highly curated US president's reading list for summer holidays, that would be a victory for, I think, Chinese sci-fi, at least in terms of monetary takings. So yeah, boring answer, sorry. I do have quite a lot to say about sort of the bad readings or bad packagings of translated Chinese fiction, because this was what part of my dissertation was about. I was sort of just comparing how the mainstream translated Chinese fiction is packaged versus Chinese sci-fi. I went in thinking, is Chinese sci-fi going to offer an alternative? And my hypothesis, most of the things I found kind of confirm that, but there were some surprises. So I'm going to try and be as concise as I can. In my literature review, I found 3 quite good characterizations of problematic reductive packagings of Chinese fiction, translated Chinese fiction. One is the tendency for like blurb quotes or reviewers or whatever to focus on national allegory. So every book must be telling some kind of metaphorical story about the Chinese nation, which means in this case, mainland China. And like some authors are doing that. I could name a few. Han Song, I think, is one. Jia Pinghua has got some books that are like that. But if you are applying this framework wrongly, it's annoying. The one really good phrase I got from Ken Liu in his intro to Invisible Planets is oppression as an interpretive crutch. So basically going in on default mode thinking this book is from an authoritarian state. So, and this is by a creative person. Creative people always fight authoritarian states and they will hide their messages in their literature. That happens, but that's a stupid thing to go in thinking for every book you're going to read, especially since although China is undoubtedly an authoritarian system, the political system is authoritarian, it's not North Korea, and it's not even the Soviet Union. It's a consumer society where, you know, you can live there, you can buy what you like, and you, like, I've lived there. Granted, I wasn't a citizen, but I could live my life not feeling the heavy weight of oppression upon me, which isn't to say it's not there, but yeah, it's really not as simple as probably a lot of Westerners think it is. Last thing, the documentary realist readings of books, the idea that every story must be just a picture, an insight of China, when actually loads of literary Chinese writers use like absurdism quite heavily. They're not really supposed to be realist, but you'll see quotes on the back of the books saying it's a picture of a snapshot of China, when really literary realism is like not how a lot of writers write. And I'm sorry I'm keeping going on, but this was the thing in my dissertation I was proudest of. I looked at the paratexts of books. Paratexts are everything which is not the main body of the text. Could be an intro, could be a quote on the back, could arguably even be something visual like the cover. And I tried to come up with like a frameworks of 3 different kinds of paratexts. One is reductive, which is basically doing all the no-nos and the oopsies I just described. One is neutral, which is just presenting it as literature, which I think for some people is the ideal. But my favorite, and you can please do come at me for this, is that there's a third, progressive, which does frame the book as Chinese lit, but does it in a positive way, or at least a way that doesn't commit all those oopsies I just described. And I have some examples. So this is a great author, and this is a great book, and aesthetically, this is a really nice cover. But I would say Lenin's Kisses by Yan Lianke, published by Vintage, does a lot of oopsies. So like, there's some, I would say, racial dog whistles in that art, possibly. Not to say it's bad art, but it's a bit dubious, I think. The original Chinese title doesn't have Lenin in the word. His embalmed corpse does feature in the novel, so that one's debatable. There's a quote which describes it as, it says, Yan Lianke movingly chronicles the price that communist China's rush to get rich has extracted from its vulnerable rural majority. So again, this is an absurdist book. This isn't like a chronicle of the nation. It's maybe metaphorically in some ways, but, and also it's communist China's. So we're marrying the party and the state, and the party would say, thank you. That's what we'd like you to do. But I don't think that's a very helpful way to frame the book. That list goes on and on and on, but I won't stretch it out too much. This is an example of what I would say very neutral packaging. It's maybe helped by the fact lots of people know who Lao She is, and he's got 3 body on the front there. Lots of people know 3 body. This book's blurb just describes the story. The quotes say it's a creative, fun, and interesting book. So for some people, this is the ideal. It's sci-fi, which just so happens to be Chinese. My best example of sort of a progressive packaging of a book, lots of ants, yeah, would be Ken Liu's Invisible Planets, which has 2 subtitles on the front cover. I'm sorry, I don't have the book with me. The first subtitle says, An Anthology of Contemporary Chinese Science Fiction. Contemporary, a word which gives it some literary weight. And then another subtitle, 13 Visions of the Future from China. So emphasizing China, but using a very catchy phrase, visions of the future. There are other positive things, or yeah, there it is. Thanks, Yen. There are other things I could say about what that book does. I think some of the coolest things about it are the intro material, where Ken gives his own very personal, quite opinionated guide to how not to read the book in ways we've just been describing. And then he has 2 essays from 2 of the authors, Chen Qiufan and Xia, who talk about like specific details about modern Chinese literature and the sci-fi lit scene, which talk about the reality and not our sort of, or I say our, maybe default Western imaginings of what it might be. And I think Ken made some really good choices in how he put that book together. And that was, I'm really going to stop talking now, but yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Angus. You have generated a lot of comments, which I take as brilliant. Thank you. Well, you stop off at a really good point, because we have a question from Luhai on, is there interaction and cross-influence between mainland Chinese sci-fi and diaspora Chinese sci-fi? And that last example that was given is one of the biggest crossovers or cross-influences, Ken Liu. He's the man himself who has been critical to bringing Chinese sci-fi into the Anglophone world due to his works as a translator. There are many stories that are around, about how Chen Qiufan had reached out to him and they had connected and created the connection. And then Ken Liu translating Liu Qixi's works, etc., and everything else, as they say, is history. But I'm going to pose this question to Xueting, because I think as someone who is diaspora and is working in both, in Chinese sci-fi and working across both mainland and diaspora work, she would know a lot more details about this. And I also wanted to kind of bring back one of the comments that Guangzhao made when he talked about British Chinese sci-fi work by academics and American Chinese sci-fi works by academics, where there's a lot less that we can find in the UK. It's also similar that I find in terms of literature itself. There's a lot more Asian American literature that can be seen as Chinese sci-fi or within, or sci-fi that's written by diaspora Chinese writers. And there's a lot fewer in the UK, by British East or Southeast Asian writers in this kind of same frame of thought. So with kind of this in mind, Xueting, would you like to try and answer Lu Hai's question, please? And just to repeat Lu Hai's question, is there interaction and cross-influence between mainland Chinese sci-fi and diaspora Chinese sci-fi?
I've just unmuted. I've forgotten I've muted myself.
That's okay. Go on.
There is, I kind of see myself as presenting Chinese sci-fi to an Anglophone audience. I'm part of the diaspora, but also I feel part of the a part of mainland China as well. But of course, it is. I am, as a diaspora translator, translating works from mainland Chinese authors. So that is bridging. There's a connection, bridging the connection there. And so you're absolutely right that there are a lot fewer. So going back to, there are so many things, there's so much to say. Going back to the first question about the collaboration, maybe connection between diaspora and mainland science fiction, I wanted to bring up the area of Chinese film and the collaboration that we've seen in recent decades between the expertise in filmmaking in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, Chinese-speaking regions, and mainland China. There's been a lot of investment and collaboration. So investment from mainland China, for example, and collaborations with directors and actors from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So that's a very interesting, it's produced a lot of very interesting works and very successful, both interesting commercially successful works. And to answer the second question, and that's actually, this collaboration actually has been key to the development of the Chinese film industry as a whole, as well as Chinese sci-fi film industry, which is starting to be able to make big blockbusters and starting to develop the expertise in, special effects and CGI, and for example, so the skills in making not just films but sci-fi films. So it's going to the second question of Britain and Chinese science fiction. Yes, there really haven't been many translators or diaspora writers of science fiction, or translators of Chinese science fiction, or diaspora writers of diaspora Chinese writers of science fiction. And certainly there has been a lot less than the US. But hopefully there will be more with what Guangzhao mentioned, the organizations for research, the China Science Fiction Research Center in London, the London Sci-Fi Research Center, and also a few other organizations that I think Yen mentioned in lecture. I can't remember what they're called, but they're related. They work to promote the community of science fiction in Britain for Chinese science fiction, and also people like myself who work outside of academia, and you who work, scholars like yourselves are working towards kind of expanding that community, and hopefully we'll get more writers and translators and more conversations, and hopefully I hope to see more diverse science fiction writers. I mean, Yen, you are one yourself. That's great to see some diaspora Chinese science fiction works. It's actually, the situation is quite similar to science fiction in terms of YA, for example, or any British Chinese works. There are just not that many. I mean, we're starting to get things like Maisie Chan's middle grade novel, for example, that are British Chinese fiction. But hopefully things are changing and starting to see more. And I just wanted to mention, Yen, your question before, which I think I just wanted to add to what I would like to see in terms of Chinese science fiction. So certainly more translations. I could count the anthologies in one hand that are published around in English of Chinese science fiction. More anthologies, more translation published on the internet and in print, more novels, but also I think readers in China as well as outside I think LuXun is great, without doubt, but they do tend to be focused on the three-body problem. They do tend to be focused on one author, and I think I'd like them to see the whole tradition and the whole explosion of contemporary sci-fi works out there. And also, lastly, I would really like to see more Chinese female writers being translated into English, and I'd like their voices to be heard more.
Thank you, Xueting. And I think writers like Regina and also translators like yourself and Emily are putting in so much work to make sure that that comes through in the next few years. Let's just keep that energy going, I think. I think that's really important, yeah. On that note, I wonder if Regina is here, just so she can tell us a little bit more about Storycon, which was a question that was placed.
Yes, I am here. Listening to all your insights. Yeah. So Storycon is actually a science fiction startup in China. They have been focusing on the film and the TV adaptations of Chinese science fiction stories. Well, not only Chinese, but also like mainly Chinese. They are also working on the Monono Awale by Kanyu. the story about this Japanese diaspora protagonist. And of course, like a lot more Chinese science fiction stories. And what Storycon is also trying to do is to introduce Chinese science fiction to the global audience. So that's why they started the Chinese science fiction translation project with Clarkesworld and publishing since 2015, almost monthly, like one story each month on Clarkesworld. And also, I think like Storycon is trying to build connections between the Chinese and the international fandom. Although during the pandemic, these projects cannot be carried on. But back then, when we were able to travel freely, they had those two like fan funds. One is bringing Chinese fans to attending WorldCon, and one is to bring international fans to come to visit the Chinese fandom. And yeah, of course, that's basically what Storycon has been doing. Oh yeah, by the way, if you are interested in like Chinese sci-fi short movies produced by Storycon, they have a event with Arizona State University's Center of Science and Imagination. I will post a link there. They are inviting the film director to talk about Chinatown with a scholar on that after showing the sci-fi film called Mailbox, which is adapted from a short story by a Chinese science fiction writer called Wang. I will post the link in the chat.
Thanks, Regina. Floris just asked about the Future Affairs Administration and the Rosetta Project. Do you know about them, and can you just say a couple of words?
Yeah, I think Future Affairs Administration is another Chinese science fiction startup, and they've been doing a lot of new writer cultivation, and also like a new media platform publishing. They publish, I believe, like millions of characters on their like non-existent daily WeChat platform, both from Chinese authors and international authors. And if you are interested in more of those like players in the Chinese science fiction industry, actually the piece about that is available online. I will post a like link to it as well. It's part of the Vector issue.
Thank you. Thanks, Regina. And as I've just been told, it's time to wrap up. So I would like if our panelists today could just say a quick line to wrap up, like you can sell your, what you're doing right now, or what you heard, suggest a book to read, or anything at all that you want to talk about Chinese sci-fi. Just a quick line to everyone as our final goodbye. So let's start with Angus.
All right. So I'll just plug my podcast again, I guess. It's awesome. You can just search for it, the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast. The URL is a bit more of a mouthful, ironically. Trchfic, trchfic.podbean.com. But to make things easy, I'll put a link in the chat to a special page I made for the sci-fi season that I did, although that's not actually all these sci-fi episodes. So I also dropped a second link, which lists every single sci-fi episode I did. But of course, I've got, it's the show's tagline is all genres, all eras, all ideologies. So it's not just sci-fi in there. If you guys are interested in hearing me and a variety of guests go on and on about all sorts of stuff that you can read in English translation, it's all there. It's a podcast, so it's free. Yeah, that's all. Thanks for having me on this panel, Yen. It was really good fun.
Angus.
And it's a huge privilege to be here, really. So yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Guangzhao, will you go next, please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you as well, Regina, for having me here. And really happy to have such a conversation with all of you. And also many thanks to all the staff of the Essence of Wonder, who provide such a wonderful platform for us to have this conversation in the first place. I just have the confirmation of the name of my very own group. It's called London Chinese Science Fiction Group. So yeah, you can yeah. I think I post the link a bit early in the chat, and also you can try to find us on Twitter, right? Okay. Hope to if you're interested in any topic we have just discussed. We share Twitter and email stuff, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Guangzhao. Thanks for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. Xueting, will you share your last thoughts with us, please? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to everyone today about Chinese sci-fi and other speculative types of genres of fiction. I will try, or just promote my upcoming book again. So Synopticon is coming out in November. It's currently up on all the websites like Waterstones and other places that you available for pre-order. And I shall be doing more promotion on the book in the upcoming months. Hopefully, I will also put my own website into the chat. So apart from writing books and translating, I work with various organizations and platforms and write articles about Chinese pop culture, all kinds of from all kinds of perspectives, all kinds of aspects of culture. So connect with me on social media. Keep an eye on my website. I publish articles regularly, and just stay tuned.
Thank you, Xueting. Thanks for joining us on this show today. And on behalf of all the panelists, I want to thank Essence of Wonder and their fantastic team who put together the show for having us and giving us the space, to talk about Chinese sci-fi in such depth. And just a reminder to everyone that if you join the British Science Fiction Association right now, you can still get a copy of
Oh, Yen, you're muted.
Again. Sorry. Yeah. So if you join the BSFA, you can get this until the end of May. Thank you. And if you'd like to chat at any time or any platform about Chinese sci-fi or other things, I am at Yenoi, that's YENOOI, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and LinkedIn. It's just the same thing. And my website is yenoi.com. Okay. I'm just going to see if Regina wants to say a quick word before we go.
I just want to deliver a sincere thank you to all our panelists, to Essence of Wonder, and also to Yen. Thank you so much for putting together this rich event. I think it's really wholeness.
Yes, and I just want to say on behalf of Essence of Wonder, thank you to Regina and to Yen. We've been coordinating this show for almost a year now, putting this together. So there really was, a lot of work that went into putting together these panels, this material, and this conversation today. And it was a pleasure working with you guys. Thank you so much for your time, your energy. We all, if you could see our crew chat, we were all really enjoying the conversation, and I hope everyone else watching had as good of a time as we did. And I just want to say on behalf of Essence of Wonder, next week on May 1st, we will have a special show on Star Wars and strategy featuring Matt Kavanaugh and guests. Should be just in time for May the 4th festivities. And as always, please like and subscribe, and we hope to see you at future shows. Thank you so much. This has been Essence of Wonder without Gadi Evron.